And that's a great segue into our next question, Doug. So with Chick-Fil-A having adopted ASC 842 as of FY21, so early adopting, can you provide some insight as to why the election of practical expedients isn't just a yes or no question, right? So you've stated that these elections not only impact like the practical application of a standard, but also business practices and controls that you have around lease accounting. So which expedients might require a little bit more attention in order to properly enact?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think what makes the lease standard somewhat, maybe not unique, but there are a variety of practical expedients that most of you guys are aware of that are required to be elected or not elected when adopting the standard. And I think the encouragement that I would have is that you want to start thinking about those and documenting your positions and circulating your sort of considerations as early as possible, because as Emily mentioned, there are going to be business process changes potentially or other sort of impacts as you weigh the cost and benefit of taking a particular expedient. So I don't think it'll be worth all of our time to go through every single expedient, because that can take a long time. But maybe I'll use a couple examples of sort of where we were as an organization and some of the things that we had to think through. The first is lease and non-lease components. So that's something that's a pretty, for a lot of companies that have, a lot of equipment leases or disaggregated, service contracts where you've got elements of lease arrangement as well as, other service components. There is a requirement within both 606, the revenue standard, and the leases standard, that if you have elements that are lease components and elements that are not, that you would have to separate those on the basis of relative fair value when doing your accounting. As you can imagine, that can be a very quantitatively difficult process, not only doing the relative fair value calculation, but also getting all of the inputs. So what is the standalone value of the lease service versus the non-lease or, service related components? That can be very difficult and time consuming. When you think about the internal controls and processes that are going to be required to separate those lease and non-lease components, that is something that you would really need to consider, because as an auditor, that's something you're going to want to audit, obviously, if your client is choosing that approach. Well, ASC 842 is allowed for the election for companies who wish to not do that, to combine lease and non-lease components for the purpose of doing their lease accounting. Well, if you think about that, that certainly takes a lot of the complexity around separation out. Now, you're not having to do that relative fair value calculation. You're not having to determine standalone fair value. But to the extent that those are fixed payments in the contract, you're now ballooning your lease liability and your right of use asset as a result of that combination. And there could be downstream impacts of that. You'd have to think about your debt covenants. What does that do to your debt covenants, if anything? Who are the users of your financial statements, and how are they making decisions based on the lease liability that is on your balance sheet? And what is the result of that? If you looked at your full portfolio of contracts and you looked at the lease, non-lease components, if you have more material non-lease components embedded in those contracts, you could be talking about a pretty significant gross up to your balance sheet. And so I think that's something that you would want to consider. Another element of this is companies are allowed to make this election on a class of leased asset basis. Well, I don't know a lot of companies who've given a lot of thought into their classes of leased assets prior to 842. It was something we had to do. It's like, well, how would we define it? We certainly have real estate, have equipment, but can we further disaggregate even our equipment between like IT equipment and vehicles and furniture and fixtures? And so there is an ability to look at the nature of those assets and the risks and uncertainties on the basis of those assets and be able to say, hey, we've got sort of a variety of different classes of leased assets. And what the standard allows you to do is make an election on combining lease and non-lease components based on class of leased assets. So that could be a way of saying, well, man, we really don't want to combine lease and non-lease for our IT equipment, because that would result in a kind of a weird accounting outcome. You guys want to catch me in happy hour and hear about some weird stuff that we had to deal with? Happy to share. But for real estate, we don't want to combine CAM with our real estate like lease. That doesn't make, so we want to not combine here, but we want to combine here. You can do that, but what does that require? Now you have to document that position. You have to create an accounting policy behind it, and then think about the controls and processes, right? Maybe the last quick thing I'll share is the discount rate. Many private companies in here, you have the opportunity to use the risk-free rate as opposed to the incremental borrowing rate. do it. Honestly, do it. We chose the IBR because we have tons of leases. IBR is tough. Don't have a ton of time to get into the details of that, but it's tougher than you think to determine the incremental borrowing rate. There's very specified guidance on how you determine it. And again, guys, risk-free rate's going to be a lot lower than your IBR. It's going to result in a higher lease liability. It could result in you having more finance leases than operating leases. It's things to consider, right? Does your company care if you have more finance leases? Does that change a debt covenant? Have those discussions. Think about it, because it's certainly simpler. You can go on treasury.gov right now. You get on your funds, go to treasury.gov. You can pull the risk-free treasury rate for a variety of yields and you're done. You can send it in and you're ready to do your lease classification. IBR is not that simple, but it could result in different accounting outcomes. So these are the things that you have to sort of think about the end stage of what this is going to do to your financials and who are the sort of stakeholders in those decisions. If Treasury is going to help you with the determination of risk-free rate versus incremental borrowing rate, if you have a Treasury department, have you engaged them to see what sort of resources they would have to help with that? Probably need to start thinking about that. So a couple examples there. There's a lot of expedients, and again, happy to talk through in a offsite session or the happy hour if you guys want to dig into any more details there. But I thought those were helpful examples.
So Matt, do you have anything to add in the IBR risk-free rate? What rate to use? How to obtain it?
What I found is that what Doug was saying about all the practical expedients, I've had similar experiences as well working with private companies. Most likely they will elect the practical expedient other than hindsight practical expedient. As it relates to the discount rate, most will elect the risk-free rate going to Treasury rates. Where they might pause is if the private company is looking to go public, either by do an acquisition, they're looking to sell to another company, or they might be going to the IPO market. And so therefore they become a public entity. At that point, you have to use the IBR. You can't use the risk-free rate. And then you have to recast all of your financial statements to use the IBR. So that's one consideration that private companies go through when they think further out 1 to 3 years, where do they think they're going to be? In terms of the IBR, it is a separate exercise. It's a separate cost as well, most likely, because what we found is many private companies don't have a collateralized debt rate that's available to them. So what you normally have to do is think about, are there any public company peers that are similar to me? Can I look at their credit spreads? Can I look at their debt rates? And through a peer analysis, can I then figure out a credit spread for me? In addition to any industry spreads that need to be overlaid as well. And then you can start building your IBR. What we do is when we're working with private companies, we explain all of this. And normally there's a valuation specialist that comes in to do the work and compute an IBR curve for the company. Now, the catch is that's just day one. Following year, if there are new leases, they're going to have to update that IBR curve, which means an additional cost. So when you're thinking about IBRs, it's just not just day one and a day one cost. There are going to be subsequent costs going forward as well, year to year. Or if you have a large credit event or large liquidity event within your company halfway through the year, and then you enter into a lease 2 months later, the auditors might then ask, okay, your IBR that you have as of January 1 is now stale. You need to update it for the current situation. So those are the factors you have to think about.
I just made a remark. I'm familiar with that scenario. Is there anything special about GASB we should know?
There's plenty of things special about GASB. the one thing that I'm disappointed about the GASB standard as opposed to FASB, we don't get to use risk-free rate. We're not allowed that. We don't have any practical experience to be able to do that. Thankfully, we do. Most governments do have collateralized debt that they can analogize to. And so what they're doing is looking at the Treasury rate, comparing it to their rate, and coming up with that credit spread, and then using that, kind of on a look forward basis to come up with what their incremental borrowing rate was. This was so much easier when we were presenting this 2016 through 2020, because we would say no matter what it is, it's going to be 1 or 2 or 2.5. But now, with the way that interest rates are how they are, it's a bit more of a challenge, and there's a bit more of a variable there in terms of what governments will land on depending on their credit rating. But so that's typically how we see governments do it. The one thing that I encourage governments to do when they're looking at it is to make sure that they're being specific enough with it to where they're meeting their reporting objectives, but not being so specific to where you may be on the FASB or private company side that then whenever you implement, you're confusing yourself and you're using the wrong rate based off of how complex that you made the incremental borrowing rate calculation.
And I would be remiss to not mention, one of the changes that was made is the discount rate. At first, if you wanted to do the risk-free rate, you'd have to do it for all your leases. But the FASB heard some feedback there. It was one of the PCC, objectives early on, and so the decision was made to adjust that to where now the discount rate can be elected on a class of leased asset basis. So a lot of what Matt was sharing about pulling curves and the difficulty of determining the IBR, all of which is very true. It can be costly and time consuming. You may say for, your certain class of leased assets that are more material, that you would want to have that higher rate, go ahead and select, doing the IBR if that the cost benefit sort of leans that way. But if you're not planning on going public and you don't have a lot of the, risks of choosing the risk-free rate for smaller, less material components of your lease population, you do have the ability to select the risk-free rate for that. So that's another way to sort of manage the cost and complexity of adoption so that you can sort of pick and choose. You do have to stay consistent though. Once you make that, would be another one of those policy and control things. You would have to document that as a policy and stay consistent. But that is another sort of relief or expedient that's available to private companies.
That's a great call out.